Hi, it's David. Before we get started, I have a really important question for you. Why haven't you subscribed to the Nostalgia Trap Patreon page yet? You don't even have to pay for it anymore. There's a free membership that allows you to follow all the stuff we do. And let me tell you, we're putting most of the best Nostalgia Trap stuff up on the Nostalgia Trap Patreon. We're having conversations about Gaza, Trump, Kamala, Sudan, Elon Musk, all the whack shit that's happening in the world. That's where we do it. So click the link in the episode description and become a Patreon member and think about becoming a subscriber. You owe it to yourself. Enjoy the show. Well, all right, folks, let's do this. David Parsons here. You are listening to Nostalgia Trap. I have got a wonderful interview to share with you today, continuing our series talking with lots of authors from the University of North Carolina Press. This conversation is with Jack Reid. He is the author of a book called Roadside Americans, The Rise and Fall of Hitchhiking in a Changing Nation. And you better believe this book and Jack's work caught my attention because thinking about cars, transportation, and the sort of social and cultural elements of that is something we've been doing a lot on Nostalgia Trap lately, and this was such a fun conversation. Jack has a ton to tell us about this history, and I just had fun talking with him. So I hope you enjoy this. Go check out his book. I've got links in the episode description. Here is my conversation with historian Jack Reid. Well, Jack Reid, thank you so much for joining me. You're one of those people whose work I found while trolling through the University of North Carolina Press latest history books. But your book came out in 2020, right? Originally?
Yeah, March 2020, right at the kickoff of the pandemic period there. So
Nice. So it's like, it was great for marketing. You're just like, hey, does anyone want to read a history book about hitchhiking?
something you're probably not doing right now. Yeah,
As the
but
world goes to hell. But your book, I want to say the name of it right at the beginning. It's called Roadside Americans, The Rise and Fall of Hitchhiking in a Changing Nation. And I had never really, it was one of those things that's kind of like, I would be jealous if I were in the same history department as you as a grad student and you're working on this dissertation. Because I'm like, hitchhiking. I had never really thought of that before. So I'm going to do the NPR question to start us off. Like, Professor Reid, why hitchhiking? What got you into that?
yeah, I mean, the answer might make that grad student more jealous. It was, I was, after I graduated from undergrad, I moved to New Zealand for about 5 months and was working on these farms. Have you ever heard of like willing workers of organic farming? You kind of you work on this farm for like 4 hours a day, and then you have basically a place to stay for free, and they feed you. So I had bought a car when I worked there or moved there for very cheap. It was not a nice vehicle. It was always about to break down. But as I was traveling from farm to farm in New Zealand, kind of living the dream there, there would be these young people about my age that were hitchhiking around the country. And so I started picking them up because they looked just like me. I could relate to them quite easily. And, picked up Germans, different people from all over. And the thought, growing up, I grew up in Springfield, Illinois, central Illinois. And so it had never really crossed my mind to hitchhike. I was someone who liked getting out there and traveling and doing what I consider adventurous things. But it took me getting to New Zealand kind of on my own to decide, oh, hitchhiking is a thing. And so eventually when I came back, I was talking to my dad. I was about to start grad school, and I was talking to my dad. Yeah, there's all these folks hitchhiking out there. And, I picked some of them up. It was interesting. He's like, well, I used to hitchhike in the 70s, and told me a couple of fun stories. But, first time he ever did it, he got picked up by a limousine and went to Chicago. On the way back, he just stood for 5 hours, not getting a ride. So less glamorous on the return. But so we had a chat about, how he had used to hitchhike, and then he talked about his father and my grandfather used to hitchhike in the 30s and 40s. So it was something that struck me. Wow, this used to be something very present in our country, and now it's gone, and it's still happening elsewhere. And so that was the kernel of what became my master's research, and then I parlayed that into a doctoral dissertation research project. So it was something that seemed simple, hitchhiking, why'd it go away? Well, it's too dangerous, cars. And then there's just all these different layers and facets to it of like, well, was it more dangerous? Is it more, have our sense of personal trust and safety evolved? So there's all these elements that became part of it that just became fascinating and difficult to untangle. It's a fun project, but it's a complex project because there's all these, you know, talks about sexual violence and like just violence in general, like all of these different elements of it became,
Yeah.
a lot to handle, but a fascinating journey.
Well, I don't want to give it away, but your book sort of it's periodized in like a kind of chronological way. It's
Yes.
sort of like made me think a lot about how hitchhiking evolved in these distinct eras and how it really like the attitudes towards hitchhiking in each of those eras. So maybe we can think a little bit about that because like I had always associated like hitchhiking in my head was like the two things you just mentioned. It was either like a hippie thing that
Mm-hmm.
like Jenny was doing in Forrest Gump, you know what I mean? Like
Yes.
but there's also like the scary hitchhiker thing. Like it was like the hitchhiker seems like a horror movie type trope too. Is like either picking up a scary hitchhiker or hitchhiking yourself and getting picked up by some serial killer.
Yeah, and that's what's fascinating about history. And this happens to me all the time too, where I just assume something out there has always been that way. And then you like dig a little bit and you're like, oh, this is like a way different conception of it than it earlier was. And so I had that kind of same experience when I started to dig into it. It was definitely a hippie phenomenon in my head. I was really into the 60s and 70s culture growing up, and then beat literature and all this different things. So to me, it was kind of a hippie thing. And then, yeah, of course, it was this associated with violence and dangerous, unhinged people
Mm-hmm.
from scary movies or horror films. But as I started to dig into it, it was quite the opposite, where there was people riding the rails who were considered folks just out on the lam, exploring for adventure and different things. Woody Guthrie, maybe they were looking for opportunity. They were laid off from work, but they took to the rails. Where what I found out was that hitchhikers were almost like the middle ground between the people that were not accepted by motorists or the mainstream culture, someone that you would kind of pick up because the people riding the rails would get covered in soot. And, if you tried to hitchhike, people are like, oh, I don't know. Like, I don't know if I want you in my car. But the hitchhikers would try to distinguish themselves, not ride the rails, and wear nice clothes to, show that they have goals. We're trying to get work. We're trying to do these things. And so early in like the 30s, hitchhikers were the folks that like were considered themselves more upstanding or respectable individuals who were on the road. And like maybe a journalist who's out of work trying to. And so it was these people in like shirts and ties. And granted, that was a much more common look, in the 30s, but they were always like vying for respectability or often, or, young kids trying to hitchhike to the pool or something like that. Like lots of 12 and 13-year-olds hitchhiking. That's another fascinating thing. And yeah, it
God, that's
evolved.
amazing. I had never thought about that. Of all my years thinking about tramps riding the rails in the Great Depression, I never thought of hitchhikers as like a different like sort of class presentation, like you're trying to like be a middle class person, like I'm a traveling salesman or something, rather than just like a desperate, dirty person that's like on the train, which is I guess like a few steps down that ladder.
The book talks. There's this journalist who's out on the road, and he would write reports of what it was like to be on the road. There was journalists writing papers in all these small towns, and they would meet him as he's passing through town. He would ask about work. They'd say, "Hey, there's not really anything available, but we'd love to hear about what's going on up there." And he would pen these kind of passionate ideas of like, people are misunderstanding what it's like to be on the road. Like people like me, we're industrious, we're doing these kinds of things. And so because there's all this tension between the westward pioneer, which is this lionized idea within American culture of like people just go out and get it. If there's not opportunity, they find it. And so that's this idea of people moving westward and doing these things. But on the other end of that spectrum, there's just rootless wanderers. And so it's kind of gets like, well, like, are you just moving around now? Are you looking to improve your family? Are you looking to find work? And so there's this tension between those two areas. And what I found was that Hitchhiker kind of was like in between those two poles, and they drifted in between one side to another. And so it was just kind of fascinating to dig through that.
That's
But
one of the things that popped out to me reading just the introduction to your book, in terms like trying to get like the thesis, because I'm like, hitchhiking, it really is like, the more I think about it, the more it connects to like the entire history of the 20th century, honestly, and like all these. It does seem like a project that would have it would be hard to get a handle on, but it seems like a major point. And correct me if I'm wrong. I'm going to paraphrase your thesis here, but like that there was like a balance, like that the hitchhiker stands at sort of like a very particular balance between a lot of different forces, and that the hitchhiker's disappearance like indicates a disruption in that balance in some ways. Is that right?
yeah, and that's what made it like I wanted to have a more clear cut. Yeah, when cars really came in, that's when it fell away. But there's all these like shifting five or six forces that were, when they aligned, hitchhiking would be really strong. When they weren't aligned, it would kind of dip. Um, and the 50s, when the country became more affluent, hitchhiking kind of, so I should, back up and say hitchhiking was really popular in the 1930s and 40s, during the Depression, and then during World War II. And we can get into why it was popular in World War II, but there's gasoline and tire restrictions. And then, so it was really popular and well respected during that time period. Lots of people were service members, in uniform, hitchhiking. People built structures along the roadside. The military, like communities, even the police built structures for hitchhikers to go into, because
Wow.
the idea being that this is for service members. These are people sacrificing for their country. Like, we don't want them sitting out in the cold as they're waiting for a ride. And yes, they could take the train or a bus, but it was less consistent. If you can walk out and get a ride immediately, you're probably going to get closer to your destination faster. And so a lot of the service members wanted to hitchhike. And so this became reshaping kind of what we considered a hitchhiker to be. It's like, it was seen as unpatriotic to ride by yourself because of the gasoline restrictions. And so it was all about like carpooling and these different.
What a different world, man. It's like,
we take for granted is like, oh, that would never happen. It's like this used to happen all the time. It's just different.
well, it's like we became socialists more than ever during World War II, and that's always something that sticks in my head as like an American historian, 20th century. I'm always like, World War II, like there's these, I like the CCC. There's all these little New Deal programs, and I know it had a lot to do with FDR, but like just what you're mentioning, I'd never thought about that before. That there were like the military's building hitchhiking huts, and we're all
Yeah,
like cooperating and shuttling the GIs around, and like it's so limited, obviously, but it's
yeah, and I
refreshing to
think
hear.
there is that would have never happened. We were a pretty individualist country who have never gone for a lot of those ideas. But after, the Depression and kind of crippling economic opportunities for people trying to find work, it's like people started to reshape those ideas. Then World War II, you're just scrambling to protect your country from, this like Nazi onslaught. So you're just, how do we get through this? And so people really reshape some of their ideas. But then once the war ends, affluence kind of returns for a lot of people. I mean, the caricature of the 1950s, everyone's got their car and their nice suburban home and different things like that. All of a sudden, it's like, well, why do you need to hitchhike? Let's. And you don't need to do that. You're probably doing something wrong if you're hitchhiking. You should be able to make it in this kind of economy. But what starts to happen is these like young people in suburbia are like, this kind of sucks. It's everything's comfortable and predictable. I hear all these stories about what it was like. This is when beat literature's kind of taking off. People are yearning for something outside of the comforts of their suburban homes. And when I say people, I should say like white middle class people for the most part, or who's hitchhiking during this time period, working class people as well. But so you start to have this sense of like, how can I get out and adventure? And then that's where you see this resurgence in the 60s and 70s, and especially with the rise of the counterculture and that kind of lionizes the idea of on the road, which features hitchhiking and all these different things. So yeah, the counterculture hitchhiking kind of breathed life, or the counterculture kind of breathed life into hitchhiking because it was this way you didn't have to have a job, you could kind of get around uh, for free throughout the country. And so people were on the move, they were hitchhiking. It was a way of kind of building community among that group where you're in a hippie van, you see someone with long hair, you pull over and pick them up, you all hang out. Oh, you got to meet this person. They head off somewhere. So it was popularity in that as
Become the
well.
opposite, it sounds like, of the 30s vision. I mean, all this like respectability, like so, like
Yeah, they
it's not like can it all be Jack Kerouac? It seems like it's part of it, but like I'm thinking of like Kerouac was doing all that stuff in the 40s, and then the book came out in the late
definitely.
50s, I think.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. It was partially that. It was partially like even in '64, there was 1964. There was a Sports Illustrated magazine feature on the sport of hitchhiking or sport hitchhiking, and like it was a travel thing. I think young people traveled to Europe in the '50s, and there was a lot of people hitchhiking over there, and so they came back and were in like into the idea. Yeah, this woman, Janet Graham, wrote a story about sport hitchhiking in 1964 and about this idea of like how fast can you travel across the country and you and a friend or something both set out and see how far you can get and compare notes about where you're at. And it became almost like you're collecting a merit badge of like, I rode in a farmer's trailer, as I was crossing Kansas. Oh, well, I rode in a hearse and it was like picking up all these unique experiences that you would never, otherwise have. If you lived in Iowa, all of a sudden you're in, the South riding in somebody's car that you would have never otherwise interacted, or you're going up the 101 in California. It's like, wow, this is spectacular. And you're riding with some surfers and different people that you would have never met. So I think it was just, it created all these open new opportunities for people to live outside their normal routines.
Was
In
that
the best in the best case scenario, I should say. There was other incidents that led to violence and things like
Well,
that. But
that's part of the adventure, man. I'm thinking like it sounds like, as sort of adventure and romance gets tied to this experience and less so just sort of like a functional a way around like the GIs. It
yeah,
seems like the romance part of it is partly the travel, geographical, seeing new places, but also the social element, the adventure of like who's going to be in the driver's seat when
yeah,
I'm picked up, right?
absolutely. It was definitely a social component of it. And I should note quickly that there, even while people are out there for adventure, there's still people hitchhiking because they have no other way to get around and those kinds of things. There's still this sense of like you have to do it and you have another option. But some people still found novelty in that. Like maybe they didn't want to have to at first, they would prefer to take a plane or something. But if given the opportunity to stay home or still go out on the adventure, but you have to hitchhike, many opted to hitchhike in that kind of situation. But yeah, it became this real socializing thing. Think about in the 30s and 40s, you had maybe a radio, you're a traveling salesman and you're just bored out of your mind driving. There's not very many places to stop and hang out. You pick up somebody and you're like, hey, can you drive for a little bit and tell me some stories about what you've been up to? So it's kind of interaction with this person to hear about life and what they've been up to. A lot of times these people would say things they've never told anybody in their life, and they're like, well, see you later. There's no social. Yeah, they're not gonna like post. Just picked up a really strange person who opened up. His name's this. Like it's they would just never see this person again. Like, it would be some farmer in a community who's just like, my wife just died and I don't know what to do, and they would just open up in really raw ways. And so it was an opportunity for socializing that way. Maybe you were a countercultural kid in Kansas, but didn't really relate to anyone in your high school. You get out west and get picked up. All of a sudden, you're part of this broader community. Even like families would pick up hitchhikers and be like they're a zoo animal. Like, tell me about what you're up to right now.
Yeah,
Like, and they would
right.
just, especially in the '60s, if you're kind of clean cut, um, they would take you on vacation with it. Like, there's a few people journals that I found where they got picked up and taken with this family through Arizona and California, and then dropped them off, in Lake Tahoe, and like you'd spend several days. So yeah, it just became a social event as well as a transportation event for sure.
There's something to do. I know this is getting to the later part of your book, but like as this phenomenon sort of disappears, it seems to indicate that, like, I don't know, we don't trust each other anymore, or we're not interested in anonymous sort of interactions this way, in the same way. I mean, it seems like a lot of different things going on, but I'm also like thinking about, we were like, do you remember this HBO show, early HBO, like Taxi Cab Confessions, where it was literally like this stuff, where it's like the idea that, like, oh, if you're in the taxi cab for a brief amount of time, you'll share this intimate information with each other. But of course, it was surveilled and put on HBO. But
Yeah, yeah, I definitely think there's something to that. I think nowadays it's interesting where there's almost, this we are so online and we're so disconnected in some ways from real interactions among people in the community that I do think there's like a yearning for what people had in those hitchhiking experiences, but there's this fear, you're like afraid to like press through to the other side to actually do it. Um, but I do think there's a yearning for that interaction, but people are just too afraid to try. I talked about in the book how like Uber and Lyft and these kinds of things are almost like a commodified version of hitchhiking, where you have somebody but it's been, now you pay for it and people are screened through technology, but they don't have like a chauffeur's license like a normal taxi driver or something would. And so it's interesting how I think a culture has certain interests in what they're willing to do, and our culture has rejected hitchhiking, but they like the idea of convenience, safety, these kinds of things. We're willing to pay. So what was appealing about hitchhiking was maybe like its unstructuredness, its cheapness, all of these different things. And people are like, I like structure, and I like, I'm fine with paying a little bit of money to get from here to there. Like, and I want to know what your background is and that people have said nice things about you. You can pick. So I think we kind of choose what we're going to have in our society, and hitchhiking's been downvoted and in a lot of ways. So.
ah, that's so scary, dude. Because I mean, it sounds like dating and Tinder and
Yeah,
that sort of thing, where it's like in the past there would be like you had to take risk. There was risk in life, and that was actually part of the adventure. Was like, I'm dating a person that I don't know, and I'm going to find out more about them. Where with Tinder or something else, like Uber, you're like sort of screening. They're like the person is pre-screened, and it
yeah,
robs. I don't know. I don't want to be this is the nostalgia trap. So it's like I don't want to fall into like it was better before. But it seems like we have lost some sort of, or become much more like fearful, and the technology allows us to sort of like make sure that everything's okay before we do it. And that like robs us of some of the spirit of life, if I'm gonna be the hippie about it.
yeah. I think so. I mean, we're safer, but are we living better lives in some ways? That's a question I often think of. It's like I think about autonomous cars. Like, this is going off in a bit of a tangent, but like there will be increased safety with autonomous cars and different things. But part of or self-driving cars, I guess you'd say, there'll be
The
great.
robot cars.
Yeah, but like something about, like, I think about when I was 22 or 23 or whatever, and I'm driving around New Zealand. It was, for me, even going back there. So that was in, let's see, 2008, I want to say. We had pretty structured components of our driving. Everything was very, there's posted speed limits. You have to do these certain things. In New Zealand, it was kind of like going back 30 years or something, especially in parts of, like, I was in the North Island of New Zealand, and there's this place called 90 Mile Beach. And they're like, yeah, you can drive on it. There's no speed limit. And I was just like, well, are you sure? Like, you can just do whatever. And, I don't know how accurate this was, but this is what someone told me. So I'm like this 22-year-old. They're like, yeah, I mean, the big thing is when the tide comes in, you can get, sucked out to sea if you're not careful. So just, be aware. And
Yeah.
that's the kind of risk, but then I got to go really fast on this beach and just make sure the tide didn't come back. Now that I feel like if that was part of it, you would just never get to do that in the first place. So there's this give and take with it. So yeah,
Well,
that
yeah, no, I mean, that's why I wanted to talk with you because hitchhiking just opened up for me. I was like, all of a sudden, I was like, wow, I mean, we talk a lot about cars and electric cars on this show and sort of like what changes because so much of the American century, whatever that is in the 20th century, is like tied to cars and like, what you're tracking is a very particular kind of relationship that is tied to romance and is tied to all these like psychological elements, but it's also tied to politics. And it seems like um I don't know. We got to talk about like sort of how does hitchhiking get written out? Because it seems like part of what your thesis is sort of like a society that does move towards safety and security and distrust,
yeah,
and into a kind of I don't know what we might call in the conservative umbrella is one that doesn't have hitchhiking in it.
yeah. One of my favorite images in the book is this idea of a hitchhiker. This is anachronism standing, along this sleek, curated roadway. It's modern roadway advancements, super highways, all these different things. And then you have this hitchhiker that's not supposed to be there. Like you're supposed to do it at the on ramp. You're not supposed to be a pedestrian anywhere near this road. In the past, like on the cover of my book, it says hitchhikers will be arrested. And it's the entrance to a turnpike, and this guy's just brazenly hitchhiking right in front of it. And I love that image because before the turnpike or the superhighway and all these different things, it was easy to just stand alongside the road. Then with the advancements of modern technology and roadway building and cars going faster and faster, and you don't want to stop in every small town. So all of a sudden, the idea of picking up a hitchhiker became more complicated. Maybe you even wanted to give them a ride, but you have to almost pull off on an exit or something to pick people up because they can no longer stand. They're not. It's against the law to stand on the side of the road. And so this idea of hitchhiking was getting written out of public policy by safety measures, they're trying to curate more um, uh, like safer roads, more predictable driving behavior. And hitchhiking is inherently unpredictable, right? Like it's also there's a person standing there, and if a driver's not careful, they slam on their brakes and someone rear ends them. So it creates lots of traffic accidents. And so even from a purely like so there's this one end of it where J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI is like, this is allowing these, potentially communist or subversive agents to travel throughout the country. We need to stamp this out. There's potential criminals along the roadway. So there's that end of it. And then the other end of it's just like mundane safety issues of like, hey, when these people are standing on the road, it leads to traffic deaths and all these different things. Let's just get rid of it. They shouldn't be on the road. And so you have this effort to have more predictable driving, and hitchhikers just didn't fit with that move. And so
This
yeah,
is like the 70s and 80s. It sounds like this is happening.
well, it started in the 60s. It was as part of a wider, there's just tons of, this is something that also we forget about. There's just enormous amounts of traffic fatalities in the 50s and 60s. Like
Yeah.
cars were not very safe. The Everything began to get legislated where the grades of roads had to become, altered so that they could become safer, so that you weren't just driving in Colorado and all of a sudden it's like a huge mountain grade that you just careen to your death because your brakes went out. Like it had to be something where it's a little bit more modified. They would have signage about this, and so they're trying to limit traffic deaths. The cars themselves used to have these steering wheels that were like on a big rail. So if you got in a wreck and the steering wheel broke off, you could get impaled on
This is
your
all the Ralph Nader unsafe at any speed stuff, right? Or they like literally
so
succeeded in convincing them to change it.
yeah, it's kind of looped into this broader effort for driving safety.
Yeah.
And so hitchhiking is just one element of that. And then in addition to that, you start to have by the late 60s, early 70s, young people like, under 18 that are hitchhiking around, go to San Francisco or Summer of Love, all that stuff. So that's also freaking out, government leaders and parents and all those different things. Like we shouldn't have, underage people wandering highways. And so there's the public safety element of like road safety. There's the, child safety, all of these things kind of blurring together to create a situation where you should get rid of hitchhiking. But what's fascinating is all of these forces are working against it at the point that it's the most popular. Like police officers are going to school saying you should absolutely not hitchhike. There's like public service statements like do not hitchhike, and all these like 12th graders or 10th graders or 8th graders are just like cool story. I'm still doing it. Like it was hip to hitchhike. You would get bus money from your parents and you would ignore that to go buy beer or something. And
It
if
was
you could,
the kids were cooler back then, man. That was an outlaw era. Because you think about like, wasn't that the
yeah,
height of the criminalization of marijuana? And like, I think that was also the height of like kids in high school smoking weed. Like it was just kind of like that was the culture.
yeah. And so there's all these forces trying to get hitchhiking to stop when it's the most popular. But I think what happens is the counterculture kind of loses vogue. It starts to subside in mainstream popularity. And then it's almost this holdover of like, oh wow, people still hitchhike. Look at that old hippie that's trying to hitchhike. Whereas the next generation, I think I have this line in my book where it goes from easy rider to risky business, where this idea of kind of celebrating the counterculture to then celebrating, almost entrepreneurial spirit, individualism, kind of mocking the idea of trying to help your fellow man, those kinds of things. So yeah, it's a fascinating distinction of how those attitudes have evolved.
Something that I didn't know was that hitchhiking started to become stigmatized and even criminalized by the 1960s, right?
Yes, yeah. So, well, and it had been criminalized to a degree, going back to even like the 20s and 30s, but it was selectively enforced, which was really fascinating. So if it was like an upstanding character, I'm doing air quotes here, uh, someone that looked like they were well dressed, or like a white male on the road that was seeming like they were fitting in with societal norms of this person looks like they're going to get a job, or they're looking for work, or they're a college student. And again, I say college student, in the 30s and 40s there weren't a ton of those, but um, if you looked like you were out and you were up to something that was going to advance society, people were willing to look the other way about some of these hitchhiking laws. If anything, a police officer would pick you up if you're a college, like a white male college student, and drive you to where you needed to go, and ask you how you're doing. And so those laws are very much selectively enforced. Whereas if it was a woman, there were actually laws in the 30s that they would take you to your next male of kin. So you couldn't really be out alone, kind of on the road, wandering around, basically, or looking for work, or doing
Right.
whatever you're trying to do. And so there would be women on boxcars in the 1930s, or women trying to hitchhike that would dress as men, to avoid kind of police harassment, basically. They're like, look, we have to, look for work just the same as you do, and I don't want to be a burden on, my brother's family. I'd rather try to figure this out on my own.
Mm.
So pretty interesting, on that front. And then, the same for a racial minority during these eras. If you're, an African American trying to hitchhike, you're definitely going to get scrutinized more by police and other drivers, for that matter. And so there's all these different laws that have been in place, but for the most part, they would be ignored, unless there was a reason to try to pull you over, or excuse me, to try to arrest you in that moment. Those laws really started to get enforced in the 1960s because the people on the road evolved. Instead of it being a clean cut high school student, or on vacation for the summer, or some sort of service member that's on the road trying to get from their base to home, and it's like this individual that a police officer would look fondly upon. It's now long haired, young people potentially uh, hitchhiking to a concert, or someone that's living off the grid or something along those lines. And the 60s might be a bit early for that. It's like 68, 69, and the early 70s is when more of that's taken off. But if you have long hair, you start having these hitchhiking laws applied to you, or vagrancy laws, or something like that. And so,
You
and
said
it's
69. I'm thinking about like the Manson family. And I
yeah,
mean, I
yeah,
don't know how much that had an effect and how much of that is mythology, but I know that like, that was huge national news, and all of a sudden people are terrified of hippies.
yeah. That was a stark change, because I mentioned at some point, picking up a hippie hitchhiker was almost like a zoo animal for some of these Asian families who are like, oh, where are you going? What's your life like? And then after the Manson murders, that's definitely happening far less. That kind of whimsical, like, what are you up to? It turns to more fear. And so,
I think Texas Chainsaw Massacre, I could be wrong, but I think that movie starts with like a long hitchhiking, picking up a hippie sequence.
yeah, it's been a long time since I watched that. The one that people most often turn to is it was like an HBO movie with Rutger Hauer from Blade Runner fame, uh, called like Hitchhiker, and that was, I want to say, from '84. But that is really, starting to cement this idea of the hitchhiker as like a psychotic, maniac who's out to murder people.
And he
There
also
was
needs a ride.
Yeah, totally. There was older. There's a movie. I'm kind of rusty with this, but I think it's called The Hitcher or something from the 1950s that
Yep. Yeah.
built some of that idea as well.
Hmm.
Um, but it's interesting. One of the things I do in my book is look at these cultural productions of hitchhiking and what kind of values get associated with it. In the 1930s, which is a more, pro hitchhiking era or more open to hitchhiking era, there was um, I was going to say Sometimes a Great Notion, but I think that's a book from much later. But
Hmm.
there's this movie starring Claudette Colbert. The title's naming or failing me here, but basically it's like this traveling businessman trying to hitch a ride because her car breaks down, and she like hitches up her leg, or her dress to show her off her leg, and they get a ride right away. And so it's kind of a little bit more soft approach of it. And then by
It
the 80s,
happened. I'm looking it up right now. It's called It Happened One Night,
it
right?
happened. Okay, yeah. Um,
And I think
thank,
they spoofed that moment in a Cheech and Chong movie where,
yeah, it's kind of a famous theme, so
yeah, right.
that's funny. Um, and so, yeah, just the cultural production of hitchhiking evolves. There's a movie from the '70s called Thumb Tripping that's kind of the hippie take on it. They're on LSD, and they're trying to like get from California to somewhere else. Stuff like that. You have the Sweet Hitchhiker song by Creedence Clearwater Revival, different things. But I think you had asked earlier about like laws that were starting to be enforced toward hitchhiking. Part of that is just for the safety measures of the 1960s. There was all these highway fatalities, so they're trying to make the automobile itself safer, but they're trying to make the roads safer by making the grades that are available on highways more uniform. So it has to be like 7%. I can't remember the specifics
Hmm. Hmm.
on that, but just trying to make roads less unpredictable. And hitchhikers and the practice of hitchhiking is inherently unpredictable, right? So I think there was an effort to try to remove hitchhiking from these roads because people would slam on the brakes when they saw someone along the side of the road, and that could lead to car pileups and rear ends. So the idea of a hitchhiker being on these like sleek modern highways was
Right.
was something that wasn't thrilling to the engineers putting it together, and folks in the federal government looking towards ideas of safety, not just because they thought everyone who's going to get hitchhiking was going to get murdered or something, just from the basic fact of it's unpredictable, and we want predictable circumstances when people are driving these highways. And so the cover of my book is this individual hitchhiking next to one of these modern highways, and there's a sign next to it that says "Hitchhikers will be arrested," and it's him. It's like right at the start of this like uh, limited access highway, basically. I think it's the New Jersey Turnpike. Uh,
Hmm.
and so you see this kind of image of it's. I kind of liked it because this is what it used to look like hitchhiking. You would just stand on the road and you'd have access to this road. People would pull over. But now we're entering this era of limited access highways. You're not even supposed to stand by the roadside. You've got to stand by an on ramp or something like that. And it's so hitchhiking's becoming more and more popular among the youth culture right at the same time as it's it's kind of getting legislated against in some ways because it's dangerous to automobile predictability and automobile drivers. And so that for the in the 60s and 70s doesn't really slow things down because the youth culture of that era thinks hitchhiking's hip, and so the fact that authorities don't want you to do it doesn't really slow people down. They're like, oh great, I could ride the bus with this money that my parents gave me, or I could, buy something that I want with that money and hitchhike, and they'll get
Right.
there. And so that that element of it continues forward, and police do start to try to arrest hitchhikers more if they have like a hippie appearance or if it's a woman on the road. The women's liberation movement is taking off in the 70s, and there's more and more women that are hitchhiking, and so they become targets of policing. And I mean, there is also increased, crime, sexual assaults against some of these women hitchhikers that are on the road. So it's not all just kind of
It's a
unrelated.
dangerous world out there. It seems like I don't know. Did it become more dangerous? Because you describe in your book, and you've talked about in this conversation, like the sort of older era where there was sort of like this respectable hitchhiker and this sort of
Mm-hmm.
social exchange happening that was more might be like an expected part of driving. But it seems like what you're describing at some point is it's like all of this becomes way too dangerous and for everybody. It seems like.
Well, and it's difficult to tease out because one of the things that I try to push get back against a little bit in the book is the idea that hitchhiking was really safe in some periods and really dangerous in other periods. Like it,
Okay, yeah,
an element of risk at all times when you're hitchhiking, and people just focus less on the dangerous elements of it in certain areas. So in the 30s and 40s, there are still, all kinds of incidents where people are getting murdered on the road, or a hitchhiker steals your car and beats you up. Different things like that are still happening. But instead of that being the leading news story of the day, it's just like, well, this unfortunate thing happened, but we all know other people that are good that are hitchhiking. So we're not really concerned about this small minority of incidents that are happening. I think what starts to happen, what makes it more dangerous, is when the so-called do-gooder hitchhikers, the people had honest intentions of just trying to get from one place to another, stop hitchhiking and start buying used cars or using alternative forms of transit. And then you have this uh, desperate individual that's on the road that might be a little bit more emotionally unhinged, or they are, just desperate because they don't have money, and so they're turning to a life of crime. So that person's always been on the road, but they were a much more marginal group on the road because there was a lot of other people hitchhiking. It was just more common. And so when all these other people leave that dynamic, you're left with a more robust version or more robust ratio of these individuals that are, up to no good that are on the road. And so if there's a time where it gets more dangerous, I think it's because of that.
yeah. I
And
mean, you see a person. When's the last time you saw someone with their thumb out, like trying to hitch a ride? Have you seen that in your life? I assume you have.
yeah, well, when I was living in Arizona, it was actually fairly frequent. The Navajo reservation is next door to Flagstaff, where I was living, and so it's still pretty common on the Navajo reservation to hitchhike, which is a cultural thing in many ways. People, elderly people would hitch between towns. Basketball is really popular on the res, so going to basketball games between different high schools, people would hitch rides to those games. Um, People would hitch rides back and forth between the res and Flagstaff. But there's also out west areas that I would see like a cross punk culture. Looks like kind of a punk rocker with a dog, uh, and those folks would ride the rails too, but
Yeah.
sometimes would try to hitchhike. So, but I wouldn't often see like a middle class person if the common person hitchhiking and all these other areas was like a white middle class dude or a working class guy, like you don't really see that very often. It's a
Right.
more um, it's just not common culturally. I did say that when I was in my early 20s, I was in New Zealand and people were hitchhiking plenty out there. And that's when I started picking those folks up. And that's what made me think of writing this book in the first place. But in the United States, I definitely didn't grow up seeing many of them. I grew up in central Illinois.
Hmm.
But being in Arizona, there was, some folks hitchhiking, but definitely not touching the common, number that it would have been in the because I read some of these articles where there's like 20 people waiting for a ride on the side of a highway in
Wow.
California the weekend, like, or in World War II, there's all these services. It's just was way different. And I think we've lost connection to that of just how common it was. And
Yeah, I'm trying to like fit it into like a larger history here because I mean you mentioned like the whole shift from easy rider to risky business and like hitchhiking in Reagan's America doesn't I mean there's that little hippie flash that happens in the 90s, but I don't know if hitchhiking came back. But I associate it just in my life like with a counterculture sort of thing. Like usually like a down and out sort of hippie dude or I don't know, they seem out of time almost when you see them. But yeah, it's been a while.
I think what happens is you're totally right. Hitchhiking becomes more and more connected to the counterculture, and when the counterculture is thriving in like the late 60s and early 70s, hitchhiking becomes like I'd say 1975 is the high watermark of the most people hitchhiking, the most widely accepted is. That's when like even state politicians are urging to decriminalize hitchhiking or come up with like hitchhiking posts in Connecticut and different places. Like you start to see it kind of take hold, and that's during an environmental movement that's kind of growing during that time period as well. So
Yeah,
there's a
yeah.
influences that are coming together. But what starts to happen is the economy starts to slow down in the 70s. Vietnam War, ends, and the counterculture starts to split from the traction it had in terms of mainstream culture, and you start to move into the 80s and that's my point of going from risky business to or excuse me, from easy rider to risky business. What young people started to, or what young people thought was hip and cool of like living a simple life, hitchhiking different places, the idea of cooperation and communalism is definitely not part of it. It's like way more interesting to a young person in the 80s to have like a cool car and to try to go to the mall, and it's more built around consumption and like there's a Tom Cruise line where he's like, I just want to help my fellow man to his high school friends in that movie, and they all start laughing. That wouldn't have been a line that was played for laughs, 10 to 15
And
years
that's the
earlier.
world you and I sort of grew up in, right? Is that like that Ferris Bueller's Day Off, like bounce, bounce, chicka, chicka, like that sort of world. And it's so weird to me to like that we had to like discover that there was a world and an attitude that was so different just like a few years before we were born.
Yeah, yeah. My parents' generation, my dad hitchhiked but I didn't know anything about that. And the idea of him doing that seemed crazy to me. I'm like, you did that? Like, uh, and I just think
Yeah.
the 70s were a completely different spot than the 80s. And what happens too is in 1982, there's this massive spike in homelessness, but also in unemployment because the Reagan administration and the Federal Reserve are trying to fight inflation, and so you have this huge increase in the it's called like a percentage of. We're dealing with this right now, where they're like trying to rate interest rates, and so
There you
there's a huge
go. Yeah.
interest.
If you're talking about economic terms, I'm lost. But yeah,
Yeah, I and so there
I'm
was
a
this big
cultural
spike.
historian for Christ's sake.
There was a big spike in unemployment and homelessness, the biggest since the Great Depression. So
Uh-huh.
there's this
Yep.
army of people that are kind of, and this is also deindustrialization. All these factories are closing during that time period in the so-called Rust Belt, and so you have people that are like struggling, and there's less services available. There's the attitudes around it, and the Great Depression. It's like people recognize we're having a hard time. The country's going through a hard time. You need to kind of cooperate, look out for one another. Of course, there was always people who are like, this is on you, self-reliance, figure it out in the 30s. But more and more, that was kind of the culture of the 80s was a notion of self-reliance, individualism, and that was touted by the Reagan administration policies as well. And so those people that are on the road, so it's this twofold thing. There's a culture of consumerism and capitalism that's taking off that doesn't really gel with hitchhiking and kind of values that would make hitchhiking popular. And at the same, so there's fewer middle class people hitchhiking. They instead are focused on, riding the bus or buying a used car or something like that. And then at the same time, you have the a really big spike in people who are having a hard time economically during that time period. And so they might not be able to afford a car, had to sell their car when they lost their factory job. And so they may have taken to the road out of desperation and not this like idealism of like, I'm looking for, the West Coast and, I'm going
Right.
to take a break from school or go find myself or something. It's people that are like, are itinerant laborers that are trying to find work. And the longer they're on the road, the more and more marginalized they are because they're getting dirtier. It's just a rough life for those folks, and that's what I try to characterize in the book is, that the chapter title is like going down the road feeling bad, and it goes from the counterculture to this like much more marginalized group that are just struggling to get by, and it's like sad. These people are having a hard time, and the book is bookended with the Reagan hitchhiking himself in the 1930s as a college student, and then ends with the Reagan administration in the 1980s, where the cultural values of the country had turned against the idea of like helping those kind of people.
And it
So
never came back, right? I mean, it feels that's what's so dark about the fact that you could like bookend your book, like you could end with Reagan and with this particular thing, because what you've located at with hitchhiking, I mean, I don't want to embarrass you or anything, but I really enjoy this window into America, the last like 50 years, because it's and more because it's like that people talk about food deserts, but like you're describing like transportation deserts, you know what I mean? And like people left out, and that part of it, it seems like we have homelessness now, an unhoused population that seems bigger than ever in all our cities, in the suburbs. I live in the suburbs, and it's bad. No one is picking anyone up. There's no hitchhiking going on. So I
right.
just wonder why that is, and it seems like your book explains that.
Yeah, I just think there's a fear of people, and I don't think I would pick a lot of people out. Like I'll be totally honest. Like
Totally, it's
it,
horrifying.
it's this there's this urge within me to be like, I want to help this person. They're clearly having a hard time. But then it's like, I have two kids and I need to kind of look out for them and like my own safety. And so we have this much deeper, more layered kind of response to these issues. Whereas in the past, I think there was just a greater sense of trust among people that's like, all right, this person's gonna, it was just more common too that people would need help with transportation. And so we're just in this different era, more concerned about safety, personal safety, and less trusting. I've read some really fascinating examples where people talk about the breakdown of public transit and mass transit. Like when you're riding the subway every day, you just see different all the different economic groups and different backgrounds, and you're just part of it. But when you're driving a car every day, it's just like who you live with in your neighborhood and who you work around and wherever you're going, but you never interact with really other groups because you're just in this like self-contained automobile, not really interacting with these folks. But if you're striking up conversations, with another guy, wearing a Knicks jersey on the subway,
I'm so
you know,
glad you said that because I was thinking about this the whole time. I lived in New York City for 15 years, so I rode the subway for most of my adult life, honestly. And there, I can go either way on it. Part of me can very easily like romanticize the sort of like we're all in it together and we're talking to each other. And the other part of me like become a cynical New Yorker that's just like fuck all these people and I don't want anything to do with them. And there's no sociality here anyway. Like there's a sort of no one's talking to each other and that sort of thing. It actually reflects maybe the historical change you are identifying, which is I don't know, a drop in that kind of imagination of a social relationship.
yep, yeah, and then I did an interview in March. So my book came right out. My book came out right as the COVID pandemic was starting. And so it was right as this lockdown was starting too. And so I was doing an interview with NPR, and they were saying, like, obviously no one's going to really want to hitchhike during this, but how do you think this will impact hitchhiking? And I had looked at, these previous moments that really tested the country, the Great Depression and World War II, these like where everyone's kind of in this difficult moment. It's always brought people together. You've started to see this sense of cooperation grow. And so I like naively was like, we're gonna, I think, come together as a country a little bit more and start seeing it. So it could lead to greater notions of social cooperation. I think it was kind of the opposite now. In some ways, like years later, there's some social cooperation to be sure, but also just a division and kind of a response to that whole pandemic. And so, yeah, it's fascinating. I do think there is a yearning for the kind of interactions that people used to have. Like we're all on our phones, we have social interactions over our phone, but it's not the same as kind of human contact and kind of having conversations. So there is this degree of loneliness that I think, when people used to hitchhike for their summer vacations, they would have all these stories of meeting all these different kinds of people. I had a different version of it when I like went abroad to Europe as like a college student and met all these people and had these adventures. It's like you're out of your comfort zone and you're just meeting a lot of people, and it's really exciting. I think there is a yearning for those kind of experiences that's just not really present. And even you have a commodified form of hitchhiking now with like Uber and Lyft, but it's through the lens of the market economy too, where it's like it's not even a set price. It's like, well, how many people need rides right now? Okay, it's going to be more expensive. They don't have a chauffeur's license, but it's a much more professionalized version of, instead of it just being a stranger that's picking you up, they have an app that tells, 500 other people have given this person a 5-star review. They must be safe, different things like that.
And you can request that they not talk to you, I think, too, right? Which is insane.
Yeah. Yeah. So the kind of element, and that just makes me come to the point of like, we don't have hitchhiking because our society doesn't value any of the things that hitchhiking offers. They value transportation, but I'd rather pay a little bit of money to have a more streamlined experience. The idea of talking to strangers, people don't really value that. I mean, some people do. I have good conversations with a lot of those people. I enjoy like seeing where they're from and different things like that. But we get the things that our values start to reflect, and our society is not really interested in those kinds of things. And that's why we have things like Uber and Lyft that are taking off, or private transportation. It will be interesting. There's high-speed rail networks that are developing. I don't know if that'll take off at all. But
hitchhiking is it seems like almost like a ghost of an era in a way. It almost seems like a phenomenon that's dead, wouldn't you say?
Definitely. I think, what's interesting is that it's happening elsewhere in the world, but it's definitely not common. And I would ask many of your viewers I'm 40 years old. I just turned 40 earlier this summer. If anyone younger than me, like knows of, I certainly didn't growing up. For me, it was talking to my dad and my grandfather about, so that was a more common thing. And then when I researched this, it was like, wow, this was, very common. One thing I will say this, I was in Panama over in January, and I was on a sailboat with my wife, and we had like rented like a captain that kind of feeds you and different things. It sounds we did not spend very much money.
I love it. Sounds great. Yeah.
But we were cruising around, and there was all these other people out there, and there's this whole phenomenon of sea hitchhiking where people jump from boat to boat across the world and kind of hitchhike that way. So I think there's elements of it that still exist. There's couch surfing.
Just the migrant population seems like it's involved in all kinds of hitchhiking. I mean, it does seem like if movement is kind of like the global survival of climate change and all the political shit that comes from it, then hitchhiking would be a global phenomenon. And in the sea, God, that just imagine how many stories are being made there. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So it's no longer the same, version that it once was.
Right.
I'm guessing that idea is out there in some sort of way. So,
Jack Reid, thank you so much for joining me. This was a fun conversation.
Yeah, appreciate it, David.
I want to just say the name of your book before we go. It's called Roadside Americans, The Rise and Fall of Hitchhiking in a Changing Nation. Super thought-provoking stuff. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, my friends, I think that's going to wrap it up for Nostalgia Trap this week. I want to thank Jack Reid for coming on the show and talking all about hitchhiking with me. I had a lot of fun. Go check out his book. It's called Roadside Americans, The Rise and Fall of Hitchhiking in a Changing Nation, and I have links in the episode description. along with links to the Nostalgia Trap Patreon page. If you want to go become a free member, check out all of our stuff, including our News Trap episodes, where we're talking about Gaza and elections and all the freaky stuff happening in the news. Come join us. We appreciate it. We'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.